By any measure, the maritime industry is without a doubt one of the most dangerous industries to work in. Workers in this industry are exposed to virtually every kind of safety risk there is. Ships on the open ocean are obviously subject to the elements, and those who support the industry from onshore have their own safety issues to be concerned with too. Virtually any safety issue you can think of is at play in the maritime industry. But here's some of the most common: defective ship products, adequate safety training, toxic chemicals, explosions, sinking vessels. So, how are safety issues regulated? The maritime industry is, of course, subject to the rules and regulations of the Occupational Safety and Hazard Association, commonly known as OSHA. But other laws further regulate safety in this industry. The Jones Act exists to protect workers who earn their livelihood on seagoing vessels. There is also the Longshore and Harbor Workers' Compensation Act. This law is in place to protect the rights of maritime workers who support the industry from onshore. But because both of these laws are in place, maritime workers are entitled to seek compensation when they are injured in accidents during the course of their duties. For seamen, sailors, and ship workers who spend more than 51% of their time on a vessel in navigable waters, the Jones Act is legislation that made maritime law a federal obligation. The Jones Act deals with injuries and illnesses that occur out on the water. It means that if you were injured or became ill while on the water, you're entitled to recovery, no matter who's at fault. You do not have to prove guilt or unseaworthiness. Under the Jones Act, a worker who was injured or became ill during the service of an ongoing vessel is entitled to the rights granted under maritime law, including maintenance, cure, and unearned wages. Benefits under the Jones Act and maritime law allow for basic remedies, but additional benefits may be awarded if it can be proven that your employer or ship owner was negligent or that another crew member was at fault. In this insider exclusive Justice in America Network TV special, our news team goes on location in Maritime Worker Rights, Joe Cracchiolo's story, to examine how Joseph Orlando Jr. at Orlando & Associates successfully won a major verdict for Joe's family. They will explain the protections workers are entitled to working on these dangerous vessels under maritime law. Maritime law recognizes those who work on the water, such as seamen, dredge workers, captains, and crew members, frequently work in dangerous conditions. Depending on how a seaman was injured, General Maritime Law, the Jones Act, and unseaworthiness dictate his or her entitlement to compensation. Each of these particular maritime claims has unique and specific requirements in order to obtain compensation from ship owners and operators. Joe Cracchiolo was a well-respected, long-time, experienced Gloucester fisherman and engineer who one night slipped on an icy ramp, falling some 20 feet to his death in the icy waters of New Bedford Harbor while attempting to return to board the commercial vessel, the Sunlight, on which he was working. This surveillance video showed that he tried to pull himself onto the platform, but it was too icy. His death was the fifth over 2 years in the Gloucester fishing community. Under maritime law, a vessel owner has an absolute non-delegable duty to provide safe and reasonable ingress and egress from a vessel. His employer knew or should have known that it was placing its crew members in grave jeopardy by not providing them relatively safe access to the vessel along the customary route along the north side of the building. Carla Cracchiolo, Joe's widow, filed suit for wrongful death based on a negligence theory against the operator of the dock, Eastern Fisheries, and RCP Realty, the owner of the property, and against the owners of the boat Joe worked on, O'Hara Corporation, under the Jones Act. Carla's legal team, Joe Orlando and his son Joe Jr., fought a hard-won battle to get justice for the Cracchiolo family against a federal judge, Douglas Woodcock, whose decisions were overruled by the First Circuit Court of Appeals and and resulted in a substantial settlement before the jury rendered their verdict. All told, the entire settlements were for $1.35 million for the Cracchiolo family. Joe Jr. have earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as some of the best trial lawyers in Massachusetts. They built a substantial reputation nationwide by consistently winning cases other law firms have turned down. And their amazing courtroom skills and headline-grabbing success rate continue to provide their clients with the results they need and the results they deserve. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Gloucester, Massachusetts. It is my great pleasure to introduce Joe Orlando and Joe Jr. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tell our audience a little bit about your law practice. What type of law do you practice here, Joe?
Well, since 1980, when I opened the practice, we were a personal injury litigation firm specializing in admiralty law. Over the years, we've represented thousands of fishermen, blue water seamen, and other maritime workers.
Right.
The practice evolved to a broader scope of personal injury litigation. And that's what the practice still is to this day.
And you just followed in his footsteps, right?
I sure did. Large footsteps. Yep. I was born on August 27th, 1984, and I was designated the heir apparent.
Okay. This is the town, by the way, if our audience remembers the movie Perfect Storm, right? Where a lot of fishermen lost their lives. I think there were, 2 ships that went down? Were there 2?
With the Perfect Storm, it was one vessel that went down, the Andrea Gale. Yeah. In fact, many of the 4 crew members who died when that vessel went down, I believe it was 4, this office had represented some of them in the past. In fact, their families came to us at the time after the Andrea Gale went down seeking representation.
Right. That's a dangerous life, isn't it? Being a fisherman.
I don't think there is a more dangerous occupation than being a commercial fisherman, especially if you're a commercial fisherman in the North Atlantic. You're talking about Georges Bank, the Grand Banks. You're talking about rough water and relatively small boats.
So why do people do it?
Well, it becomes part of what you are. Fishermen, and many of the fishermen on Cape Ann, in Gloucester, New Bedford, come from Portugal, the Azores, Sicily, where they fished in the Mediterranean and in much calmer waters. And they came to America because fishing here was better, more profitable, and more dangerous. Mm-hmm. But of course, when you're trying to feed a family, the ability to make more money on a better boat with better equipment is something that draws you. And also, many of them aren't educated and are not trained for anything else. So fishermen are what they are. And I like to think somewhat romantically that when salt water mixes with your blood, it's a lifelong addiction.
Right. We talked about this earlier, some reality TV shows about, fishermen. I think it's up in Alaska or wherever it might be. Do some of them do pretty well?
They do very well. A fisherman, first of all, the vessel owners and the vessel owners can do extremely well. Mm. The captains do very well. Even the deckhands can make well into 6 figures, okay? They can support their family very well. Where most people who are sometimes illiterate, for instance, Mr. Cracchiolo would fall into that category. Okay, someone who was illiterate, who came and found an occupation in which he could take care of his family, provide a nice life. They could make a very nice living, and they do many times.
Yeah, and that's why we're here today. We're here to talk about Joe. Joe had passed on, unfortunately. Tell our audience a little bit about his story, who he was, and you eventually ended up writing a book based on the case. It's fictionalized, of course, right?
but why this is an important case to you.
Joe Cracchiolo was an immigrant to the United States and to Gloucester, a commercial fisherman from Sicily who came to America, landed a job on a commercial fishing vessel with an Italian captain and an Italian crew where they spoke their Sicilian dialect or some version of their Italian language as they worked and as they lived. He married a sweet young woman, Carla, a very nice woman. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, and bought a home and had a nice life. Hard-working guy, he was a very outgoing personality, the life of the party many times. Carla would often just smile and watch him entertain when they were in between trips or at the holidays, etc. There was a real love affair there between Joe and Carla. I mean, it was really a strong bond, and they had a beautiful family. Joe was a commercial fisherman, and he was fishing on a vessel, the Sunlight, and that vessel was a herring boat, and they were out fishing. And in the winter, that boat docked in New Bedford. And while fishing, a pipe broke in the engine room. So the vessel came to dock, unloaded its catch, and the crew, which were Gloucester fishermen, all jumped in cars and drove home. New Bedford's it's about a 90-minute drive. Drove home, except for Joe and another crew member who stayed to make the repair, to oversee the repair in the engine room, because it had to be repaired before they could go back to sea. So they did. They spent the day making the repair. And about 7:30 that evening, it was late January, I believe the 28th of 2011, Joe and the crew member went out to get some dinner. And they did. They went out and they went to a pub. They had some dinner. They watched. There was a basketball game, a Celtics game on. And they had dinner and a few drinks. And the crew member came back to the vessel earlier, about 10:30, 11 o'clock. And Joe stayed to watch the end of the basketball game. When the basketball game ended, he came back. Now, he, in the meantime, had communicated with the crew member and discovered through the crew member that when he came back to the dock, the gates to the property were locked. They had big swinging gates, and they had been locked with a padlock. So to gain entrance to where the boat was, where they were sleeping, they went around to an adjacent property, came down. Now, you have to try to mentally picture. It was roughly a rectangular lot. You went around to the edge of the property where there was a chain link fence that was pulled back. It was a few feet from the end of the dock anyway, and it was pulled back. So the fishermen walked, and then the dock was covered with ice. And they normally came in through the gate, walked on the north side of the building, and stepped on the back of the vessel, the aft portion of the vessel, which was roughly at the height of the dock. He came in, the bow was facing in the direction he came. So he came along the capstan, the 1 foot high, 1 foot wide wooden feature at the end of the dock, which is bolted down and where the boats are tied off to the cleats. And he walked along that. There was a raised platform where the fish was dumped when it was, and that came right to the end. So when you got there, you had to turn sideways and sort of shimmy along that till you got to the after section of the vessel and step on. Well, the crew member did that without a problem, and it's on video, because there was on the building a video. When Joe was shimmying along, he slipped, fell into the harbor. Now remember, it's late January. The ocean's very cold. And according to the autopsy report, he drowned. Okay? And he wasn't discovered till the next morning.
Yeah, he tried to grab onto the dock to pull himself up, and he couldn't.
He couldn't do it. He couldn't save himself.
Yeah.
And what happened was we discovered through reviewing the video repeatedly. Now, You have to understand that when I handle, or when this office handles a case of this magnitude, it's always a team effort, okay? We literally had myself, my son Joe, who was a relatively young lawyer at the time.
1 year in.
And the judge decided, for reasons that still to this day puzzle me, because it had no basis in law. It was absurd, and it was really harmful, because once the case was thrown out against the dock, the banks foreclosed on their house. I was holding them off. With, listen, let me try the case. I'm going to win the case, you'll get paid. And they were being cooperative.
You were talking about the Cracchiolo's house.
The Cracchiolo's home, where a widow and 2 children who had lost their father were living and holding on by their fingertips until a rogue judge, and there's no other way to describe his actions as other than a rogue judge, for what reasons that I'll never understand as someone who's practiced maritime law for over 40 years, can discern, made the ruling he did. So they lost their home.
I want you to imagine for a second that you're watching a screen. You have 10 or 12 hours of video from several different angles. You're sitting in front of a computer, and all you're looking at is a blank screen for hours and hours and hours and hours. And then something happens, some motion happens, and it activates. And you're waiting for something to happen. And a lot of times it could be a squirrel running across, and then it goes on for 10 seconds and turns off. And you're watching nothing again. And we had several angles, and we had several discs, and we had split it up between myself and Amanda after my father and Brian McCormick had both given it a shot. And it took several efforts by several people for Amanda to discover this spray.
The spray wasn't so obvious. Now it is in retrospect, but at the time, a strong wind would have activated it.
What was the spray?
Well, the spray was a hose. They had hosed down, they were hosing down the dock where fish had been done, and this was about 8:30 at night, so it was after the 2 fishermen left and before they returned. And of course, it was below freezing, so it iced up. So Mr. Cracchiolo, Joe Cracchiolo, found ice. Didn't see it, of course, because I think it was after midnight that he came back, so he couldn't see it. So when he shimmied along, there was a coat of ice that he had no way of knowing, and which caused him to slip off the dock.
So let's talk about some of the legal challenges you had in this case. Meaning, of course, okay, Joe, unfortunately, is deceased. Someone's to blame. And tell our audience a little bit about how you went and discovered to make sure that the people who, or the companies that were responsible, compensated his family for
Well, it was a challenge. My father and Brian, who were lead on the case, I was a first-year associate. It was quite an education watching them. But they had a real challenge on their hands, and that was there was 2 defendants. There was the vessel, and there was the dock. And I'll let you explain the differences here, but we also ran into some issues in the judicial system itself, which caused excessive delay and caused immense pain for the family. In fact, they lost their house. There was bankruptcy. There was a justice delayed being justice denied flavor to this case that was significant. So some legal challenges. Of course, you have essentially a slip and a fall on ice, but other issues too. The gate being locked, there being no key provided to the crew. That was in dispute, but there was never any evidence of the key being provided to the crew to get in and out of the dock. The dock, they were sleeping on that boat. That was their home for the night. So we had a lot of challenges, not the least of which in any maritime case is that a lot of the evidence comes from the crew, and the crew is employed by the defendant.
We filed suit in federal court. We used both federal law, federal maritime law, and the suit against the vessel. And we used Massachusetts state law and the suit against the dock, land-based law.
And this is a wrongful death case.
This is a wrongful death case. And so we brought an action, and we joined them together in the federal court. So we filed suit, and during the course of litigation, the defendants, as is typical, filed motions for summary judgment to have the cases thrown out. Now, there was no logical legal basis for that to be allowed. There were factual issues in dispute, and factual issues are settled by the fact finder, the jury. The judge his job is to make determinations of law. But for reasons unknown to me,
Till today,
Judge Douglas Woodlock decided that he didn't believe that there was sufficient evidence to prove the case against the doc, the landowner. It was absurd. It was without legal support, which was argued to him. But he allowed the motion for summary judgment as to the dock, did not allow it as to the vessel. And frankly, the vessel was a tougher case than the dock, okay? I mean, there was OSHA violations on the dock, which ultimately led to us seeking punitive damages because of the OSHA violations. There was ample evidence for a jury to potentially find fault with the dock.
right. And that was their responsibility anyway, that the judge took away.
Exactly. And the judge decided, for reasons that still to this day puzzle me, because it had no basis in law. It was absurd, and it was really harmful, because once the case was thrown out against the dock, the banks foreclosed on their house. I was holding them off. Listen, let me try the case. I'm going to win the case, you'll get paid. And they were being cooperative.
You were talking about the Cracchiolo's house.
The Cracchiolo's home, where a widow and two children who had lost their father were living and holding on by their fingertips until a rogue judge, and there's no other way to describe his actions as other than a rogue judge, for what reasons that I'll never understand as someone who's practiced maritime law for over 40 years, can discern, made the ruling he did. So they lost their home. We ended up winning the case. The case was tried to a jury, and the jury went in to deliberate. Okay? The jury verdict form had a number of questions on it. Question one was the defendant negligent, and did the negligence cause the injuries and the death to Mr. Cracchiolo? The second question was, were they grossly negligent? That's the OSHA violations. Were they grossly negligent, and did their negligence cause the death of Mr. Cracchiolo? And the third question was the plaintiff, Mr. Cracchiolo, comparatively or contributorily negligent in his own death? And if so, did that cause his death? So the jury went out with these questions. And after about an hour's deliberation, they came back and asked a question of the court. And the question to the court was, are we allowed to find that the plaintiff was comparatively negligent, but that his negligence did not cause his death?
Great question.
So it had been exactly what I'd argued to them. I said, yes, there may have been some comparative negligence on my client, but it did not cause his death. What caused his death was the negligence of the defendant icing up the dock and not warning him. So he had no way of knowing that he was literally stepping onto a skating rink in the dock. And the jury asked the question. They came right back on the way I had argued the case. And the defendants realized they were going to lose. And they went and made significant offers of settlement, which ultimately, it ended up being about $1.5 million to ultimately settle the case, which, of course, my clients were happy. Now, I believe if we had let the jury come back, we would have made more money. But I was very concerned about some of the rulings that Judge Woodlock had made during this trial.
And then, of course, on top of any of these verdicts, right, then the other side may appeal.
Which had already happened. Because after settling with the vessel,
Right.
after summary judgment was denied as to the vessel, we settled with the vessel. We went to trial only as the dock. And the major issue, of course, was that when we went to trial, you risk, if you let a case go to judgment, that the defendant's going to appeal, you're going to delay it even further. And we talked earlier about how justice delayed is justice denied. Their family already lost their home. I'll never forget standing in the driveway trying to prevent the foreclosure sale from taking place, just across town here in Gloucester. I was sent out, go try to stop this foreclosure sale, go try to negotiate with whoever's trying to buy it, try to see if we can't get a deal for this family. Maybe we can buy some time, win the trial, give them some money, and put them back in their home. Every effort we made, unfortunately, didn't work out that well.
It's really getting personally involved, isn't it?
Well, that's how we do it here. This family was our family, is our family for the course of the case and thereafter. And you have to treat it like that. If you're not treating your client like they're your family, you're not doing everything you can for them. So it wasn't just a maritime wrongful death case. It was also, the foreclosure issue. There was a bankruptcy that happened in the interim because the family didn't have their primary means of income.
As you mentioned earlier, Joe, one of the key players in this case was your daughter, the office manager, Amanda. We have her with us today. Let's bring her on and talk a little bit more about what she discovered that made this case, okay? It is my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Orlando. Welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
You were very much involved in this case. You are the office manager, and you discovered a key piece of evidence after everybody looked at this videotape for hours and hours and hours. What was it and why was it important?
So yes, I am the office manager and I was the administrative assistant on this case from start to finish, every facet of it. So when the video came in from the defense counsel, the motion activated surveillance, as you've heard, it was hours and hours of very grainy footage, and looking at it in the office was challenging. This is a very busy office. There's a lot of phones ringing, interruptions. You really needed to focus on it. So I took it home. And one night I sat in my living room for hours and I looked at this video and I saw a spray of water, or what I thought was a spray of water. And at the time I called my husband over and I said, can you look at this and tell me, does that look like a spray of water to you? And he said, yeah, it does. When I brought it in the next day and I showed it to all the attorneys in the office, they all said, wow, you're right, that's what that is. And so really that ended up being the crux of what happened, is that we understood that that spray of water from the staff at the fish plant had created ice, which then our client had fallen on. Absent that piece of evidence, I think it would have been really challenging to prove what they had done wrong.
And the spray of water came from a hose, obviously.
It appeared to. It was hard to tell from the dark. It was dark in the video. It was nighttime. It was evening in the winter. And it was a spray that burst suddenly, turned the camera on. But again, as you've heard, this video was motion activated. It was also back in 2011 or 12, and it was not great quality. So, you're really trying to figure out what you're seeing. So once we were able to really identify that, then you couldn't help but see it. And so I was really, glad that we were able to find it, but it took a long time to locate it and a lot of effort.
And then, of course, we, through the rest of discovery, learned more about their operation relative to the actual building, and that there was a hose there, and that they did, in fact, spray a hose. They did, in fact, clean off the area from the various fish parts that were laying on the dock, and that's what happened. So key piece of evidence.
And truly a piece of the puzzle that then leads you to find the other pieces of the puzzle.
That is fantastic. That probably inspired you to become a lawyer, didn't it?
It very much did, yep. I've worked here for 16 years. It's been great to be part of our family business and to watch really, really top-notch attorneys at the height of their profession. But, I'm looking forward to the day that I can join them.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
These cases are covered by the Jones Act. What is the Jones Act and how does it protect the workers that work in the fishing industry?
The Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, was to allow fishermen, people who work in navigable waters, to have the access to a jury, which they didn't have. The maritime law does not give seamen a jury, like the Death in the High Seas Act, no jury. So the Jones Act gave them rights, more traditional personal injury rights, and a jury, which was very significant. As you could see in this case with the judge we were dealing with.
Yeah, let's talk about that judge, okay? Because, he dismissed the dock owner, right?
Yes.
You appealed that, and the appellate court didn't agree, right? They reversed it, remanded it, put them back in, right? Put them back in. You had mentioned, Joe, that normally in these kinds of situations, that same judge will recuse himself.
Or should.
From the case, or should, because, let's face it, the higher-ups are telling him, you're wrong. Talk about what happened with the fact that the judge did not recuse himself.
So when the case was sent back to the district court for trial, to my surprise, the judge kept the case. Usually the judge will simply say, I have made rulings that might indicate a bias, and even the appearance of bias is improper. So, but Judge Woodlock did not recuse himself.
Despite his comments. I mean, to put it bluntly, I mean, he made some pretty poignant comments about Mr. Cracchiolo that were really unfair and distasteful.
What did he say?
Well, he essentially, called him a drunk. And the toxicology report at the time, he had some alcohol in his system, there's no doubt about that, but it was not the cause of any of the incidents. And he had a problem with Mr. Cracchiolo. We're unclear what it was. But he made that pretty clear in his motion for summary judgment memorandum in order. So that was really part of the basis of our motion to recuse him.
Now you continue the case again with a, I will say, quote unquote, hostile judge.
Absolutely. And we filed a motion to have him recuse himself. And the judge asked me, do you think I'm biased? I said, I think it goes beyond bias. I think it goes to incompetence. I don't understand how you made the rulings you made. And you really harmed this family. Okay, this family was harmed by your...
His response?
And he looked at me. You got to understand, you put a black robe on somebody, and many of the judges are phenomenal in their ability to balance, to recognize that they're part of the system. But there are some judges who really believe that that black robe makes them better than the rest of the people in the litigation process. Smarter, more, and I think his attitude and his approach to this case and others was surprising. When he refused to recuse himself, I was stunned. In fact, every attorney I talked to in the maritime field said, who does that? I mean, after the things he said about your client, the appearance of bias is overwhelming, the appearance. Even if you could make an argument there was no proof of bias, the appearance is overwhelming, but he refused to do it. So we had to try the case. And as it turned out, as I suspected, he didn't want to get reversed again. So we actually might have gotten a few rulings that we shouldn't have that helped us.
It was a great case. I want to thank you very much for both being on the show. And thanks for sharing this with us because, this is the kind of case that we love to do because you're representing the underdog. And the bottom line is the facts don't necessarily make it provable, especially when you have a judge that could be biased, right?
Absolutely.
Sometimes the system itself can be your adversary, and that's unfortunate. And I'm glad you gave this case some sunlight because it needs it.
All right, very good. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.